When we consider facilitating a course, we first need to know the importance of community and how to achieve that social presence in our facilitation. In an earlier lecture, I did talk about the sense of presence and even gave some examples about how to design and how to initiate that sense of presence within an online class. But in this lecture, I want to look at the learning community and that socialization in a slightly different light. But first, why would you want an online community? Why is it necessary? I think you already know the answer from some of our previous lectures and some of the readings that you've done, but I want to go through some of the most important things that you need to remember about facilitating a course and developing that online community. A community supports learning, and it gets the people in the course sharing and chatting about the information that they're learning. That's one of the reasons why we need a community. Next, new knowledge can be built by listening to or reading about other people's perspectives. And that can all happen through the discussions. People need to share the information to build our community. This one you all know, but if we don't have that sense of community when we're facilitating the course, then the students start to feel this sense of isolation, and that often leads to dropout. When we have a good sense of community in an online class, the students suddenly start to collaborate and they share ideas. And remember, I've already talked about some research that was recently done about what employers are looking for. And that one important thing was people who can work in a team and who can collaborate. When a learning community is initiated, it requires rules, just like your local community where you live. These rules can be enforced by the students and also by the instructor. It's usually the instructor, though, who provides the rules and also is the enforcer. But think about your own community where you live, your real community. You have rules, you have laws, and you have law enforcement. Sometimes neighbors will talk to each other and help enforce one of those rules, but most times it's the law enforcement that takes over. So let's look at some of the rules that we need to have in our online community. These are certainly not all inclusive, and you may think of some other ones that you want to add. The first one I find to be really important, and that's to make sure everyone commits to being honest in the community. We need to avoid anonymity. And I've been in a couple of online classes where the professor allowed students to develop their own avatars, develop their own names. I didn't quite understand what good that did, but I do think that one of the rules we need to think about is to make sure everyone presents their own ideas and we know who they are. I really like this next rule, and that is to get students involved in the collaboration and in building that community from the very first day. People don't like to join a group when they're the only member of the group. So you may find that you'll have to ask certain students to please start the conversation and ask some other students to please make their comments. Although much of this is usually done through the assignment, sometimes we just have to add a spark to get people involved. Another rule you might consider using is that of netiquette. We want to have good quality discussions and collaboration within our community. So we want to make sure that the word I is always capitalized, beginning of sentences are capitalized, and people are responding and interacting in a professional manner. So that netiquette really needs to be presented to students during the first week of the class. In the area of netiquette too, sometimes students don't realize that if they type in all capital letters, it really means they're shouting. And that's not a good way to have a discussion or a collaboration if we're building community. Everyone needs to use the proper terms and the proper size font so that we can all enjoy the collaboration. I think too that we need to have maybe you can call it a water cooler area in the discussions. And I'm going to give you another idea here in just a minute. But this is a place where students can simply come and chat about anything. This is where they get to know each other as peer to peer. It's also a good place for the instructor to drop in from time to time so they can get to know the students. What are they talking about? Are there some issues in there that you need to talk with the students about? So be sure to add a water cooler area. Another area that I think is important, and that's the question and answer. And I think every week of a course should have a question and answer place. This is where students can go and ask their questions and they can give each other feedback. This is important for the instructor to monitor because you don't want mistaken information being given out. Usually students do give pretty good answers, but just in case there's a mistake, be sure to jump in. When discussions have many different people involved and many people are really interacting with each other, again, it needs to be monitored to make sure that we are building a positive community for these students. So if one person is dominating the conversation, the instructor needs to jump in. And if the debate is getting heated and you're beginning to see some of those capital letters flying around, again, it's a good time to jump in and help to facilitate that part of the course. I think we also have to use the discussion area as a learning tool. This is where you need to make students aware that there's going to be many different perspectives that are going to come into that discussion on the single topic. Learning and reading about other people's perspectives is really important, and it's something they'll have to do in their future careers. Another rule, I guess, that you might call it, that I like to use when I'm building a community and I'm facilitating a course, and that is to give a review. So at the end of each lecture, give a little synopsis. At the end of the course, or end of the week, or end of the module, be sure you sum it up for students and give them the important points of what was covered. Don't forget to ask the students at least once during the course for feedback as well. Don't wait till the end of that course survey. Ask along the way. And as I said, be sure to monitor that chat room that you've set up for students. So now let's look further into the facilitation of an online course and how that should happen. If we really want students to be interacting with each other, we have to nurture that. In a traditional class, students seek out people with similar interests. And during the breaks, before the class, after the class, the little groups or the pairs will meet and they will just chat in a friendly way. That doesn't happen spontaneously in an online class. It has to be nurtured by the instructor. And sometimes when I read the bios of my students or I ask them questions about their hobbies, their family, their jobs, I will try to say to them, there's another student in the class that has a similar job to yours. And I will give that name. And hopefully I can begin to build that nurturing community within the course. Building a community is really the focus, as I said, of this lecture, but it's also the focus of many different research projects that are going on. Some of those projects only define what community is or explains why it's important, but other research that you can find online will certainly tell you how to develop that sense of community in your online classes. Earlier in this lecture, we looked at those possible rules that I just gave you for building your community. But I want to focus on starting the community early in the facilitation of the course. Early facilitation of our sense of community begins with 3 different sets of dialogue. The first of these is faculty to student, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The second one is student to student, and the last one is the student to resources or content of the course. Faculty to student communication is certainly easy to understand. It can come in the way of feedback on papers. It can come in the discussion or the forum area. But some of that information that's imparted by the professor in a course can come from things like announcements, monitoring the written communication that's going on, even audio or video that is put into the class. When we think about the student-to-student interaction, that often begins at the very first week of the class when students are asked to provide information about themselves. And this can be personal data, but we have to be careful about what they put in there. But it can be about their family, about their friends, travel, hobbies, pets, any of those things. And I think it's also important to ask students to post a picture of themselves. Now, the pictures do have to be monitored. And so if you get a picture of a student and their dog, that's fine. But if you get a picture of a student in a very skimpy swimsuit on the boat, that may not be proper. So we do want pictures, but we want those pictures to be able to tell who we are. I also find that as an instructor, I like to give my students some of my background, not just my educational background, but some of the things I like to do, my hobbies, my past experiences, my travel, and I think this makes me be a real person to them. Just a minute ago, I talked about the importance of having a question and answer place for students. And we want students to be comfortable going in there and asking questions and even answering questions. So these are good peer-to-peer tools that students can learn from. They can use this space as their first go-to location when they have a question. That way they don't have to wait until the instructor logs in maybe later that day or maybe even the next day. They can get almost immediate feedback. I like to use announcements and even our discussion to post questions that students have asked, sometimes directly to me, but I don't want to put students' names out there, only post the questions. And I find that's important because if one student has a question, I can probably bet that other ones have a similar question. So I want to make sure that if students ask a question that they know they're going to get an answer, but then I open that up a little bit farther to all of the class so they can all learn from each other. Not all students are going to respond and be in the question and answer or the chat room or the water cooler sections. They may only post their discussion and reply to one or two people if that's required in the class, and that's okay. But we have to realize from some of the theories that we talked about in the first weeks of this class, especially that of Vygotsky's, he says that we are social beings and that social interaction is so important in an online classroom. So enjoy the students who are willing to interact easily and readily, and those who are not, give them encouragement, give them some motivation, but remember, not all students are going to be great social animals.